Now we are moving on to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 largely takes place during the winter break at Hampton College, and Richard stays in the town during that time while most of the other students leave and go home. On page 104, we get our first reference, and Richard imagines a scene in which he makes a comparison between his father and Othello, where he imagines his father with his forefinger trembling, rolling his eyes like Othello. This is a reference to the Shakespeare play Othello, and specifically to a line in Act 5, Scene 2, in which Othello enters the room of his wife Desdemona, and Desdemona says, "And yet I fear you, for you're fatal then, when your eyes roll so. Why I should fear I know not." And this is actually the scene in the play, spoilers, when Othello kills Desdemona, so Richard is making a very dramatic comparison between his father and Othello. Moving on to page 107, we hear that Bunny is writing a paper about John Donne. Donne was a 16th century English poet. He was known for his works in metaphysical poetry, which is where Bunny seems to get the made-up word metahemeralism. Then on page 108, continuing with this paper, we hear Bunny say that he's trying to tie together John Donne and Isaac Walton. Walton was an English writer who was friends with John Donne, and he even wrote a biography about Donne. And Walton is best known for his writing of The Complete Angler, which is a book about fishing. Then on page 109, after Bunny annoys Richard, he sends him a copy of the poems of Rupert Brooke. Rupert Brooke was an English poet who is known for his idealistic war sonnets, which were written during the First World War. He's especially known for a sonnet called The Soldier. On page 115, when Richard is looking for events to attend so that he doesn't have to stay in the decrepit, freezing building that he's currently at, he mentions performances of Brigadoon by the local high school. And this is actually a very interesting and subtle reference that contains some foreshadowing for the rest of the story. Brigadoon is a musical written by Alan J. Lerner, and in it, a character is tripped by one of his friends and falls to his death by hitting a rock. And this is a parallel to the death of Bunny. On page 117, we get a reference to the Prima Porta Augustus, and this is just a statue of Augustus Caesar, who was the first emperor of Rome. Also on page 117, Richard describes the letters that he writes to the other students, saying that they could have been as easily from the Gautama as myself. Siddhartha Gautama was the Buddha, and he's just saying that his letters, Richard's letters, are vague and like philosophical. He's just comparing himself to a religious leader. Richard has a bit of an inflated ego, I think. Then on page 118, Richard says that, like the Invisible Man in H.G. Wells, I discovered that my gift had its price, which took the form of, in my case as in his, a sort of mental darkness. In The Invisible Man starts to like rob banks and exist outside of social restraints, and this is in part because he can, but also in part because as an invisible person he can't interact with the world in the same way. Kind of like hard to hold down a job if nobody can see you and you have to walk around in bandages all the time. And again, in this reference, Richard is showing familiarity with pop culture and science fiction, showing that there's a bit of a disconnect between him and other classical scholars. And to be clear, I really love H.G. Wells. I think he's like a classic author, but I doubt that Henry or Julian would agree with me. Richard then mentions a Brian Eno song and provides a few lyrics. The song is King's Lead Hat, and Brian Eno is an English musician. Then, on page 119, Richard says that he has morbid Poe-like fantasies. He's referring to Edgar Allan Poe, who was a horror and weird fiction author. On page 124, Henry looks at the hole in Richard's ceiling at the place that he's staying and comments that it looks like the Pantheon. The Pantheon is a 2nd century Roman temple. It's still standing, it's still in really good condition, and it has a hole in the ceiling, but unlike Richard's ceiling, the hole is actually supposed to be there. On to page 125, while talking about his trip to Italy, Henry names a bunch of locations that they went to and buildings that they saw. I'm not going to name them all or try to pronounce them all, but I'm going to put up some pictures with their names under them. Also on page 125, Richard says that one night his head was aching from Hegel. Hegel was a German philosopher, and he's known for being really dense, really hard to parse, so it's no wonder that Richard's head hurts after reading Hegel. On page 127, Richard sees a photo of Julian and Vivien Leigh together. Vivien Leigh is a British actress. She's best known for her performances of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind and Blanche Dubois in the film version of A Streetcar Named Desire. We then hear about a bunch of people that Julian used to know, including the Sitwells, T.S. Eliot, and Marilyn Monroe. Edith, Osbert, and Sacheverell Sitwell were three siblings who formed a literary and artistic clique around themselves in London. T.S. Eliot we've already talked about, but it is worth noting that he just keeps cropping up over and over again. And Marilyn Monroe obviously was a actress. She was a model. She was a real cultural icon. Then on page 132, Richard comments that Bunny slaps his chest like Oliver Douglas in the opening sequence of Green Acres. Green Acres is a sitcom. It follows Oliver Douglas, who's a New York attorney who moves to the country to run a farm. And as for the slapping his chest part, this is specifically the shot that we're talking about here.
Fresh air!
It was ridiculous to put in back then. And especially as the book has aged, I don't think there's a single person born after like 1995 who's going to get this reference. It is a ridiculous reference, but also it tells us that it's a reference that or a joke that Bunny might be making intentionally, and also Richard recognizes. So it shows us that these are just our two pop culture kings who don't quite fit in with the rest of the group, who is really obsessed with antiquity. I mean, just look at Henry. He actually forgets who Marilyn Monroe is in the previous scene. And those are all the references that I could find in chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a pretty plot-focused chapter, and as we'll see as the book goes along, when the plot picks up and there's more actually going on, the references drop off, and it really is only when we have time to like sit around and like get hammered and be in class that we get to just be beaten over the head with tedious references. But with that done, we're going to move on to chapter 4.